The original scripted versions for Apocalypse Now's ending were insane. I'm talking an epic acid trip battle where Willard and Kurtz team up, which is why Coppola threw them out shortly before beginning the production. But he began filming without a replacement. He'd hoped that a better ending would reveal itself along the way, and when the budget began ballooning out of control and United Artists wanted to pull the plug, Coppola put up everything he had: his house, vineyard, his dream of building a studio to fund his personal films, all to keep shooting. In October 1976, he found himself in the jungle surrounded by a massive set and all the pyrotechnics, stuntmen, extras, costumes, and props you could possibly need to film a battle to rival the Valkyrie sequence. I can't imagine another filmmaker has been in the position to end an epic any way they could possibly want, not to mention one that would go against audience expectations with everything on the line. But in the early hours of September 8th, Coppola finally understood why he had been struggling for years with the ending and what it all really meant. And it would lead to an idea that was strangely simple on the surface, but complex, haunting, and mythological at its core. An idea set in motion by a mysterious creative advisor who would soon be traveling to the Philippines to give Coppola the creative direction he needed in his final days with Brando. Of course, like everything else, Brando wouldn't make it easy. You'll see what I mean when you hear why this one shot cost $70,000. And still, this ending would be missing one crucial ingredient.
But the questions that story kept putting me, I couldn't answer. Yet I knew that I had constructed the film in such a way that to not answer would be to fail.
Terminate with extreme prejudice. Are you an assassin or a soldier?
It's early October 1976 at the massive Kurtz compound set deep in the jungles of Pag San Han, and Coppola was drowning in doubt. Brando had filmed nearly all of his scenes, everything except Kurtz's death. This was the moment the whole story had been building toward, the central question driving the plot. But after more than a year of obsessing over how to end it, Coppola still didn't know. And now, his time was up. A few months earlier, a typhoon wrecked the sets, forcing the production into hiatus. Coppola returned to Napa to regroup. This was supposed to be his chance to finally hammer out the ending away from the chaos of filming. After a call with Brando, he felt confident Brando could be brilliant with the right material. But even with total focus, the ending still wouldn't come together. His wife, Eleanor, wrote, "He's been reading, researching, writing, wrestling with it for almost a year. I told him to just start from the top and dictate it all. He knows it backward and forward. He's practically chasing his tail."
My greatest fear is to make a really shitty, embarrassing, pompous film on an important subject, and I am doing it. I confront it. I acknowledge, I will tell you right straight from the most sincere depths of my heart, the film will not be good.
It's interesting that it's a river because that's just what it's like. You start out and then you start following the theme and following the story and then you realize you're making a very surreal movie, and once it picks you up and takes you and you say, yeah, that green smoke and that red smoke, and let's have a lot of green and red smoke. And then Brando was funny when he finally came in at the end. He looked at me and he chuckled. He said, well, I see you painted yourself into a corner, which was I had made the movie much more weird and much more surreal than just the big battle at the end could ever answer.
Brando arrived around September 2nd, 1976, and almost immediately he pulled Coppola into hours of deep, winding conversations in the houseboat at the location. Instead of shooting, he wanted to talk about everything: his character, the themes, the war, what it all meant. It drove Coppola insane, but these weren't wasted hours. Scattered around the houseboat were books that would aid their discussions: The Golden Bough, From Ritual to Romance, and poems by T.S. Eliot like The Wasteland and The Hollow Men. Mythological material sent to Coppola from a mysterious creative advisor back in California who was already shaping the ending from afar and would soon arrive in the Philippines and change everything. On September 4th, Coppola excitedly told Eleanor that he had a great discussion with Brando, where Brando had improvised all day trying everything, and then they made a breakthrough. Eleanor writes, Brando was going to do something he had never tried before. He was going to play a bigger-than-life character, a mythical figure, a theatrical personage. He is the master of the natural, realistic performance, and he was going to go for a different style of acting for the first time in his career. The discussions with Brando seemed to have an effect because in the early hours of September 8, 1976, after more than a year of wrestling with the ending, Coppola finally understood what was blocking him. Eleanor wrote, Francis got up around 4 this morning and went down to his room to write. About 6, he came into the bedroom and woke me up. He had just figured out why he hasn't been able to resolve the ending of the script. Every time he tried to take the script in one direction or the other, he met up with a fundamental contradiction, because the war was a contradiction. A human being contains contradictions. Only if we admit the truth about ourselves completely can we find a balance point between the contradictions, the love and the hate, the peace and the violence which exist within us. Coppola realized that there was no linear, clean resolution to this story. The war itself was a paradox, morally and psychologically, and the movie had to reflect that. An ending that resolved with a final battle would fail. It needed something symbolic and reflective, an ending that holds two conflicting truths at once. Willard's journey up the river isn't about choosing between good, sane civility and evil, insane savagery. It's about acknowledging and accepting that both exist within us. These contradictions aren't meant to be resolved. They're meant to be held in tension. Coppola had thrown out the original scripted endings before production even began. There was John Milius's patriotic acid trip battle, and Coppola's own rewrite that leaned more into Heart of Darkness, but neither worked. He stopped bringing the script to set entirely and just carried Conrad's book, trying to shape scenes around it. But even that wasn't enough. The movie had evolved into something stranger, and the ending was now being shaped by everything from the chaos of the shoot to Brando himself. Let's take a look at those endings, Milius's, Coppola's, and Conrad's, and see if you can spot the one very important thing they're all missing. Just a heads up, I generated some images to illustrate this part, because it's either that or just show you the scripted pages. In John Milius's 1969 version, the patrol boat creeps through the jungle at night, passing skulls rigged to Claymore mines. They dock at a crumbling fort, and get immediately captured by Kurtz's Montagnard army. Kurtz shows up in a tattered uniform and loincloth, locks Willard's crew in the dungeon, and parades him past a human hand-chewing child, starving monks, and concubines living in darkness. He brags that his followers would throw themselves onto poisoned stakes rather than surrender, and tells Willard that his army will outlast the Americans. While captive, the crew gets stoned out of their minds while watching napalm airstrikes for fun. When the Viet Cong finally attack, Kurtz's people, women, kids, everyone, fight back while tripping on drugs as Light My Fire by the Doors plays over the loudspeakers. The fort explodes. Clean dies in brutal hand-to-hand combat, Lance is gunned down. Kurtz vanishes in the smoke of the exploding outer wall. The next morning, Willard, Chef, Colby, and Chief shoot at US helicopters coming to get them, laughing like maniacs as they light up the sky. Not exactly the movie you remember, right? In Coppola's 1975 rewrite, it gets even stranger. The boat is waved through enemy lines by Moonbee, a weird Australian deserter who hasn't been killed because he's hiding a large stash of drugs. They meet a sick, dying Kurtz who immediately realizes Willard's real mission. Willard sets down his gun and Kurtz casually picks it up and murders one of his own followers. At night, Willard sneaks into Kurtz's temple and wakes him. He gives Kurtz morphine and then they both drink from a canteen spiked with LSD. Kurtz rants about the lies behind the war, and Chef bursts in with a bayonet urging Willard to kill Kurtz, but Willard shoots Chef instead. Outside, Kurtz's army, painted in high, battles the NBA to Light My Fire. Lance is killed, Moonbee flees, Kurtz fights with a machine gun, then a rifle, then a bayonet, then swings his rifle, before being mortally wounded by an airstrike and crawling into the jungle to die. Willard carries Kurtz's dying body back to the boat. As medevac helicopters arrive, Kurtz whispers his final words, "The horror, the horror." Willard and Colby shoot at the helicopters, forcing them to retreat. A year later, Willard visits Kurtz's wife and tells her that his last words were of her. Then we're on a yacht in present day where Willard is telling his story. The movie would have ended with Willard, adrift, haunted, carrying Kurtz's corpse as the End by the Doors plays. This version was much closer to Conrad's novella Heart of Darkness, where the protagonist Marlon carries the sickly Kurtz to his steamboat. Kurtz tells his armed tribespeople to back off, but that night, he leaves the boat and crawls into the jungle. Marlon convinces him to come back to the boat where Kurtz talks about lost dreams of power before dying with the words, the horror, and then being buried in a muddy hole. Back in Europe, people visit Marlon with assumptions about Kurtz, none true, and then Marlon lies to Kurtz's fiancée, telling her his last words were her name. But did you notice what all these endings are missing? In none of these endings, Willard kills Kurtz. That's 3 versions where Kurtz dies, but the protagonist isn't the one to do it. Over the years of Coppola trying to figure out the ending, it turns out the question wasn't how Willard would kill Kurtz, it was whether he'd do it at all. Coppola's foray and breakthrough had brought him into a desperate mania. He realized why he was failing, but not how to succeed.
Nothing is so terrible as a pretentious movie. I mean, a movie that aspires for something really terrific and doesn't pull it off is shit, it's scum. And everyone will walk on it as such. And that's why poor filmmakers, in a way, that's their greatest horror, is to be pretentious. So here you are, on one hand, it's trying to aspire to really do something. On the other hand, you're not allowed to be pretentious.
Coppola received a long fax from his creative advisor back at his indie studio Zoetrope in California, pointing out how the texts he sent, The Golden Bough, From Ritual to Romance, and T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, were all about death, rebirth, and the moral cost of power. This could be the key to everything. Coppola called him up and asked him to fly to the Philippines so they could talk face to face. The man was Dennis Jacob, an old friend from UCLA who was like a new age creative guru, and would serve as the Obi-Wan to Coppola's Luke. Jacob had cut movies for Roger Corman, helped Bobby Darin on a passion project, and helped shape Jim Morrison's intellectual persona. Jacob was the one who suggested bringing Heart of Darkness in as the spine of Apocalypse Now. If anyone could get Coppola out of this jam, it would be Jacob. Jacob arrived in the Philippines on September 22nd with a blue Samsonite suitcase and opened it right on the Coppola's living room floor. It was filled with ripe oranges, green apples, plum tomatoes, roses, figs, grapes, fresh basil, and chives from Napa. Jacob was shocked when he saw Coppola, later saying, "By the time I got there, he had run out of emotional gas." It was like Coppola had been stranded in the desert, and Jacob had brought him a cool glass of water. When they sat down to talk, Jacob told Coppola two things. Willard needed to kill Kurtz, and the ending should be symbolic, a death and rebirth ritual. Coppola was convinced. Coppola later explained, "So with the help of Dennis Jacob, I decided that the ending could be a classic myth of the murderer who goes up the river, kills the king, and then himself becomes the king. It's the Fisher King from the Golden Bough. Somehow it's the granddaddy of all myths. I was dealing with moral issues, and I didn't want to have just the typical John Milius ending."
The killer in this myth was Willard, and he was going up there to kill the king, which was Kurtz, and that all I had to do was have him kill him. That in a sense it was a ritual killing, that the king wanted to be killed because that is what makes then there be a new spring and the crops grow, and that it is as part and as old and ancient and as part of human myth and human life as could possibly be. So it made my job a lot easier.
Coppola had finally picked a path and ran down it, but he still needed to figure out how it would play out. For now, if Willard was sent on this journey to kill Kurtz and he would, in fact, kill him, then Coppola would just need to film it, and his movie would technically have an ending. After all, he only had a few more days left with Brando.
And finally you say, fuck it. I don't care if I'm pretentious or not pretentious, or if I've done it or I haven't done it. All I know is that I am going to see this movie. And that for me, it has to have some answers. And by answers, I don't mean just a punchline. Answers on about 47 different levels.
On October 1st, with less than a week left with Brando, Coppola sat down at his typewriter and wrote a memo of what he thought would be the end of Apocalypse Now. This is the ending we almost got. The memo reads, "The sequence should not have any blood or violent effects other than whatever tearing off of the costume. A little blood spattered on his face, and a hand and possibly a forearm, which is kind of a symbolic cutting of the Golden Bough. In the story of the Golden Bough, a Trojan hero must travel to the underworld to speak with his dead father. To enter, he has to bring a golden branch as a gift to the Queen of the Dead. This Golden Bough acts as a symbolic key. It lets him cross into the world of the dead and return. The journey is not just physical, but spiritual. It represents a transformation. By confronting death, the hero gains knowledge and returns changed." Coppola saw this as a symbolic reference for the end of the movie. When Willard arrives at the Kurtz compound, he's crossing a threshold into a kind of land of the dead. By killing Kurtz, not as an assassination but as a ritual, he inherits Kurtz's burden. The knowledge that drove Kurtz insane is symbolically passed on to Willard, but unlike Kurtz, Willard is able to leave the land of the dead and return to the real world with that knowledge. Coppola continues, "Other than that, all I need from Marlon would be a long lens close-up and two opposing two-shots and then a dolly two-shot and the equivalent and then whatever details of Willard to see him. Following him down the hall, glistening blood. That's the way to do it. Do it with indirection, moving shadows. Then he should fall and die with horror. When he looks in the hallway, he ought to stop, and he should see Kurtz crawling towards the figure of the woman who is backing up towards the fire. Even in death, he's like Kurtz trying to get back to the jungle, and then Willard should follow him and Kurtz should get up. Willard should never strike him again in the hallway. It makes it a lot easier to do anyway. And then he gets up one last time and then he falls again. We don't even have to see him hit the ground. We just let him fall out of frame. It's great that Willard never gives him a death blow, because he can give him the death blow at the end of the thing. When it happens, you cut to all the faces peeking through the window, moving quickly in opposite directions, then end with Hopper taking a few pictures. Or maybe that's it. Maybe this is the picture of the whole Vietnam War. The natives just back away and you have a moving shot down the hallway, all the way down, and Willard steps out in front, and there, as far as you can see, are the people. He starts to walk down, and as he does, they sort of part, looking at him. He walks down and maybe sees Lance and just walks down, and we let that shot go and he's on the boat. And that would have been the end of the movie, if not for one haunting moment he'd seen weeks earlier. And when he sat down to write this memo, he had no idea that it would change everything and become the key to unlocking the movie's final sequence. We'll get to that, but for now, Brando had just a couple more things to shoot, and of course, Brando being Brando, he wouldn't make it easy. October 8th was supposed to be Brando's last day. Just a few close-ups left at the shipping container, but nothing on Apocalypse Now ever went smoothly. Eleanor wrote that the morning was warm and tropical, with Francis and Marlon deep in discussion outside the Ifugao house. Coppola filmed until lunch, but one close-up remained. Before flying to Hong Kong to cool off, Brando had nearly driven him insane. Coppola pulled assistant director Jerry Zeismer aside and put him in charge of the final close-ups. So now, after weeks of chaos, Brando's final shot would be directed by the one crew member he probably tortured the most. As Coppola's helicopter lifted off, Brando finally strolled onto the set, squinting at the sky. "Who's flying away?" he asked. Zeismer told him. Brando stared at the disappearing helicopter, then back at Zeismer. Zeismer said, "Please, Marlon, I've got to get your close-up. Help me." Brando shook his head and then looked up. "Okay, Jer, let's get it." Was Coppola getting back at Brando by leaving? It's hard to say, but maybe Brando would have done what he was about to do anyway. As the crew packed into the container to film, Brando locked the door and started pumping in bee smoke through the slits. Everyone kept working as long as they could, coughing and choking, until they finally banged on the door to be let out. Brando opened it, laughing as they stumbled out gasping. You'd think this would be the last prank Brando would pull, but you'd be wrong. And this final one would be a doozy. Get this. He had his secretary hand out catalogs to the cast and crew, telling them to pick out expensive thank you gifts. Watches, cameras, fancy gadgets. He said he was flying to Hong Kong to buy them all, and would throw a big party when he got back. Everyone excitedly signed up for a gift. Everyone except Zeismer. Something didn't feel right. Brando's secretary organized a list of who would get what and tallied it up. $39,000. Brando took the list and sent it to Coppola and the producers along with the bill. Of course, the producers said no, and no gifts were bought. So if you're keeping count over the last 3 episodes. But right after Brando left for Manila to pack for his trip home, producer Gray Fredrickson realized they forgot something huge: Kurtz's final line. His dying words, taken directly from Conrad's novella, were meant to connect the movie back to Conrad's story and be the emotional payoff to Kurtz's monologue and the entire movie itself. How could they forget this? Fredrickson called Brando asking him to come back. They would just need 1 hour. This was vital to the movie. And Brando's reply? "Well, first of all, it's never an hour, you know that. And secondly, you'll have to pay for that day. $70,000. I'm in the Marlon Brando business. I sell Marlon Brando. Would you go to the president of General Motors and ask him for a $70,000 favor?" Classic Brando. For perspective, that's a little over $342,000 today. This likely happened on Saturday, October 9th, while Coppola was off in Hong Kong for the weekend. Jerry Zeismer, who was so anxious about directing Brando's close-ups, doesn't mention this pickup shot in his book, which pretty much confirms he wasn't there. One source says that Coppola was so angry about the money that he kept Brando on the set the entire day. It's unclear whether Coppola came back early, phoned in direction, or just handed it off. That said, there are some clips of Coppola with Brando laying there, but it's hard to say if those clips were from before or during the pickup. Either way, it appears they tried some improv.
And yet I've gone so far. I don't think that I can ever return.
And they also tried a crane shot. In any case, the madness with Brando was finally over, and here's a photo of Brando arriving in Sydney, Australia right after finishing his Apocalypse Now filming. But no one was happier to be done with Brando than Jerry Zeismer. He actually lived near Brando. After the production, whenever he saw Brando inside the local deli, he'd just turn around and leave. Brando later admitted in his memoir, "I was good at bullshitting Francis and persuading him to think my way. But what I really wanted from the beginning was to make my parts smaller so I wouldn't have to work as hard." And later, when Coppola vented in an interview about the headaches Brando caused, Brando exploded.
Francis Coppola, he's a prick. A card-carrying prick. How can you do that to me? I saved his fucking ass, and he showed his appreciation by dumping on me.
There have been a lot of similar comments over these past several episodes expressing an extreme frustration with Brando. Most of you feel like he was a complete asshole who nearly ruined the movie, and some even go as far as saying that his performance did ruin the movie. Brando showed up overweight, hadn't read the book, refused to shoot, forcing extensive discussions that seemed like purposefully wasting time so he wouldn't have to work. He demanded his character be completely rewritten on what was the biggest auteur movie ever. Brando seemed to yank control away from a desperate Coppola. He relentlessly pranked the crew and would have been happy to leave them high and dry without Kurtz's final line. His motivation? Take the ungodly amount of money Coppola offered, spend a few weeks in the Philippines, and then head back to Tahiti to lay low. At this point, Brando was over it. He just wanted to work a couple months a year, cash a massive check, and then relax in peace. And with Apocalypse Now, he would have a year's worth of money in 3 weeks, and not have to think about acting for a long time. Yes, Brando was a nightmare, but honestly, he was worth it. Brando was the contradiction. At the same time he was an egotistical nightmare who didn't seem to care about the movie, he also made it better than it ever would have been without him. Was he stalling when he forced Coppola into those endless houseboat discussions? Probably. But those talks also gave Coppola the breakthrough he'd been chasing for a year. If they had cast Jack Nicholson or Al Pacino, who knows what would have happened. But I bet they would have done what Coppola wanted, and we'd have wound up with an ending pulled straight from Conrad. We probably would have gotten an emaciated Kurtz dying of malaria. Maybe Willard wouldn't have killed him at all. But can you honestly say that any version of the ending we looked at is better than the one we got? That ending only exists because Brando didn't do what he was told. And here's the real kicker. Brando's larger-than-life persona and the antics he pulled on the set not only heightened the movie, but it added so much to the legends surrounding the making of Apocalypse Now, a story about the ultimate creative struggle, that not only did Brando play Kurtz in the movie, he played Kurtz in the legend. Coppola returned to the jungle after his weekend in Hong Kong with production designer Dean Tavares, taking a breather from everything, including his wife. He had Brando's final shots. He had footage of Kurtz's death. He even had 3 45-minute takes of Brando improvising the emotional core of the movie. It was probably in there somewhere. On October 25th, Eleanor wrote, "After dinner, we watched stills that Vittorio had taken during the shooting. Francis got excited. He kept saying, 'God, I'd go see that movie, wouldn't you?' On November 6th, Dennis Hopper finished his last scene, and after a night of partying and drinking with Coppola, he hugged everyone and left for Manila. Coppola finally had something that resembled an ending. Kurtz had been killed in a symbolic nod to an ancient Roman myth, but Coppola couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. It was heady, abstract, and relied on references most audiences wouldn't catch. The relief of wrapping with Brando was quickly eclipsed by a creeping dread. Time had run out, and he didn't know if the footage he shot would deliver the emotional impact the movie needed. He had hoped the edit would reveal something powerful, but deep down, he feared the ending might fall flat. Too vague, too pretentious, too detached. What he needed was an image that could express everything, the entire thesis of the movie, in one visceral, unforgettable moment. What Coppola didn't realize yet was that a moment he'd witnessed weeks earlier, something he was about to film just to flesh out the setting, would become the symbolic climax of the entire movie. And to make it work, he would draw from one of the most powerful cinematic propaganda techniques ever created, something pioneered by the director who first inspired him to become a filmmaker. On the next episode of Making Apocalypse Now, a real death becomes the focal point of Apocalypse Now's climax and upsets a lot of people. For this episode's companion PDF, I've put together some more info on the books that inspired Coppola's mythic ending and how they relate to Apocalypse Now, as well as a selection of interesting comments from the previous episode. It's just $1 and it really helps the channel. Or you can support CinemaTyler on Patreon at the $5 level and get access to all the companion PDFs I've made for this series.